We don't take no
Come back to the webisodes. Hi, I'm Luke Banton. Welcome to Deterioration, episode 9.
Oh, you? Oh, well, apparently they wake up every 2.
Can you say watch Deterioration on YouTube?
Watch Deterioration. What's that?
On YouTube.
On YouTube.
I think this is like a parable or a metaphor of the sort of situations you might wind up in when it comes to calling Arojatol and his bullshit, illegal bullshit, his contrary to the Rights Act bullshit. It'd be like if I'd bought, say I went to Capital Chemist Moniasa and Roger was there and he sold me an expired tube of vaginal thrush cream, and I went home and it didn't work, and then I noticed the expiry date, so I take it back and say, well, you sold me this thrush cream for my vagina and it's expired, so it's very embarrassing. I've had to come all the way back to the shop now. And then Roger would go, oh, no, we don't make mistakes. You sure there's not some sort of repressed childhood issue within your family that you're not thinking about, and is causing you a lot of psychoactive dispositions? And you're like, no, it's just the thrush cream was out of date. Oh, no, there's got to be one or more unresolved family conflicts during childhood. And you go, no, look at the calendar, look at the expiry date on the thrush cream. And then Roger would go, we don't make mistakes. And I go, right, Roger, I could see this is going to be tricky for you to comprehend. And that's the metaphor. So I also take the opportunity to promote Discount Pharmacy as a chain. That group is, they're very impressive. And if you do comparative looks at their products and the prices for their products, and there's also, if you like service where you aren't getting staff prejudice, in addition to the scripts you get, because there's this culture of gossiping about patients in relation to the drugs they get. That's quite a big deal within the Capital Group, and it's just so juvenile because the pharmacists aren't doctors, and when you're depending on how much you're suffering, you don't really have to. It's not relevant to you or to them to carry on about the scheduling grade of certain substances. Plus, they're not even the drugs you would want to be on if you were going to have a good time. They talk about their products like you're at risk of misusing them just to have a good time. Like, you are not selling the right drugs anywhere in your pharmacy for that concern to be a valid one. So anyway, so discount chemist warehouse is probably my favorite. I can remember a former employer trying to encourage me not to respect what they were trying to do when their branches started to open up in Canberra, but I would certainly say I do. I like them more. The Northbourne one is quite respectable. Um, yeah. Anyway, that's it.
Te quiero, amigo.
Te quiero, amigo. Buen amigo. You good amigo. Yeah.
Good morning, this is Luke Banton on the 3rd of February 2019, and as just a side note video, I'm just at the moment I'm rearranging and finalizing the first 3 episodes of DETERIORNATION. So the title should encompass the many levels of concepts that are explored in the series. It will journal and chronicle to some extent. It's always a bit, in some ways it's depressing. The history repeats itself, cliche. I always like to pit it against histories written by the winners and see what can be done to but the parallels between myself and 2 organizations that I devote a lot of time and effort to, and while I learned a lot, I'm starting to think that actually I'm reminded of what a girl said at a nightclub once about assertiveness being the key to your answer, and she basically made the case to me that she felt, though she thought I was well spoken and things like that, she really thought I would do better and make a better way for myself in life if I asserted myself at every point that I needed to. And so for me, that's been a case of learning a lot about when is that best to, and if it's the dogmatic authoritarian types in the organization who they can make it clear to you at certain points in your time working, whether it's a voluntary job or a slightly paid retail job. They can make it quite clear to you they do not want you to say anything that usurps their point of view or makes them feel like their authority has been undermined. So you have to ask, well, where's the line between you not doing that so that they feel more respected, but then stepping back and going, oh, hang on, actually the way they've spoken in the workplace is, once you check it against the Rights Act, it's actually them violating various, like a whole list of things. So and being at the same time liking being in favor of freedom of expression, but that always brings the question of context to the table, which is where you go, yeah, free expression is important, but like in what context? It's Howard Stern's radio show. He takes freedom of expression very far. If you're running a dance party, you enjoy watching as freedom of expression sets the tone in principle for everyone to have an enjoyable night of entertainment. So yeah, I think freedom of expression is essential, but in what context? And so then there can also be the whole thing about you're the funny guy in the group, so at work they'll find the things you say are funny, and you wonder yourself if the things you're saying are funny, but if you've pushed the line too much. But you're not insulting, you're just kind of in a way it's also part of how you learn or test your critical faculties, a bit of humor here and things like that. So But when they're outright violations of, you know, discrimination acts and things like that, in the context of art, I think freedom of expression can be taken much further. Art that you intend to either sell or give away, or publishing a book. Because when people consider the whole art piece as a whole, then they're able to go, well, this person values freedom of expression in this context to this extent, as evidenced by this piece of art. And so as I've been restricted in what I can do now because of some physically disabling pain that has only gotten really worse, particularly over the last year, but has been it's been a menace in some sense or another throughout the decade. I've had Botox injections of needles of syringes of Botox, the same stuff that they give for plastic surgery, injected into my scalp, which was like a 9-month regime, and it really didn't do anything. So you know, I kind of didn't want to go to pharmaceuticals after the career I've had. So eventually I decided to deal with someone I trust. And so now at the moment it's just back to, you know, the sorts of art forms that matter to me. There's a book that I'm writing on philosophy, which I've narrowed it down from 1,200 pages to it's now between 900 and 600 pages. But there are some more topics I want to introduce, so that's for a later discussion. But you'll see in this series of deterioration clips, to me the name is about like you and the world you've known getting eroded because you've I suppose, like, I wouldn't have bucked horns with some of the people that I had if there wasn't this drama of scientists trying to make me religious, when in principle I joined this medical scientific group for the sake of being away from religion, only to learn that all along the owners were these religious people. So so that went bad in a number of ways, which some of that's touched on in the in these clips. And then there's some talk about sort of antichrist philosophy, some of the ideas that are good for, I think, are good for antichrist philosophy and the end of Christianity. And their ideas I'm always open to discuss and debate with anybody else. But anyway, it's nearly 9 minutes, so I'll leave you there. Good morning, people. Buy Gippsland Dairy, mango, passion fruit, twist yogurt from your local capital chemist.
They make you chew worms on that show.
Oh, it says here you've done 6-man blow bangs. That's where you blow 6 guys at a time. You can put your own fist in your ass. Oh.
That's a big thing now. This is the second person we've known who says they can put their fist in their ass.
I'm thinking if I want to see that or not. Is that a tough gig? What?
It's not easy, huh?
Yeah, it's not easy.
What's the hardest part of it?
Of putting your fist in your ass?
Yeah. What makes it so
The
difficult?
thumb.
Well, actually, yeah, it's the thumb.
Is it the thumb?
You have to kind of tuck it.
Now, when you're doing something like that, your legs are spread and your whole asshole is open on camera. Do you ever think to yourself, oh man?
Do you say hi, Mom?
Yeah, I mean, do you ever think like this is a crazy life I'm living, or do you just kind of block it all out?
I've ever seen my fist in my ass.
Yeah, like let's say you're on film, you're shooting, you go to the set.
Hi, Bobby. Are you proud of me?
You spread your legs, your ass.
Hi. I wanted to talk a little bit more about
Or if it doesn't feel good, the Terry and like, oh my god, I got my
some atheist influences who I've sort of admired, or who at least I think contributed to the progression of developments in atheist philosophy. And some of those include members of the founding fathers, of course, with that typical response from the religious right. There's a famous story by Ben Franklin. I think he was the one who made the lightning rod. And at that time in his history, in his lifetime, most church buildings had steel crucifixes attached to the rooftops of most church buildings. And so when there was a lightning storm, lightning would often actually hit and strike these steel crucifixes on the rooftops of these churches. And anytime that happened, the preacher thought it was a sign from God that there were unconfessed sins in the congregation. So can you imagine that? You're sitting in a church and then a lightning bolt hits this steel crucifix. And then the priest runs around saying, well, who hasn't confessed yet in this church? Because God just struck the church. So then all these people are freaking out and they're coming and confessing about a bunch of sins. And then, Ben Franklin did that experiment with the kite where he attached a lightning rod that he'd invented to the kite, just to demonstrate that lightning and the properties of lightning had nothing to do. They were to do with electricity and the physical principles of the behavior of electricity. So he proved that by attaching this lightning rod to a kite, and then he flew the kite around, and then a thunderstorm would approach, and then the lightning would strike the rod on the kite, just as it would the steel cross on the roofs of the churches. So that proved that the movement and behavior of lightning and what the metal that lightning can attract to has nothing to do with God sending messages to a priest. And in his day, even people in the religious right were calling it the heretical rod. And they told Benjamin Franklin that he was toying with, if not stealing, the powers of God. And so while it may not be true to say that, you could say that founding fathers like Franklin were, while they were not atheists, many of their thinking had something to do with turning curb in the progression of philosophical thinking that certainly doesn't do a lot of harm to edify the history of this resurge of atheism since the Enlightenment period. And so yeah, Franklin was called a heretic, and it was called the heretical rod. Now, some things that people will say is that, well, some of the, I think maybe they will even say most of the founding fathers weren't atheists because they were deists. And deism is a form of theism, but it's not one that involves, like, maybe you can say it, yeah, it involved a supernatural God, because there was no better way for them to explain how the world came to being or to exist. But their God was called the God of deism and not theism. And in deism, you never pray to a deist God, because all he really did was start the universe, like winding up a clock. He made the planets and set the whole process in motion. But then he stood back and said, I'm not doing a fucking thing after that, like my work is done here. That was sort of his, the deist god's attitude. So you would never pray to a deist god, you would never expect a deist god to heal an illness or to cast out a demon, because I think they may not have even believed in demons. No prayer, no interventions, no saviors, no human sacrifices, no knowing God's will, no thinking you can invest or influence God's will. So they had very little in common with the key duties of right-wing religious and Christian theists to this day on the matter of who and what God was and what God can do. So yeah, that was that whole thing. Sorry about that fucking filter. And that one. And that one. Yeah, so that's a little bit on Ben Franklin. I think John Adams said the world would be better without the Christian religion. So they didn't find much favor at all with Christianity or what it had to say in their day. Yeah. So.
Well, that's what's holding me back. What do you need, like finances? How much money do you need? We'll give it. I would have I think for going to Brazil, I'm thinking.
There's more. There's more of these.
I have
Color.
A girlfriend that I know for 8 years that I'm platonic with. She knows all about
who else?
Fetish, but she doesn't appreciate.
The Marquis de Sade is another atheist who I admire, but don't go reading his books and thinking of me as like his disciple. This whole concept of a follower, being a follower to a religious figurehead, you lose all of that when you deconvert, because I mean, I'm not I've talked about this in previous episodes of Deterioration, but you know, I do have, as an Antichrist, my opinions on Jesus, for instance, and that is that is that I don't think you can rely that he even said what it is said to have said that he said in the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John, because unless you're unaware of the word plagiarism, and unless you don't think that documents written off a source document let me think, 10 to 25 years after the first one are plagiarisms, then tell me what a plagiarism is. It'd be like you taking my some essays I've written on unbelief and then saying, yeah, Luke and then 10 years later, you know, Luke the unbeliever walked on the surface of the Dixon Pool and went to Big Splash, but when he sat on the water slides, the water turned into liquidated gold, frankincense and myrrh, and the water slide, there was no one else in the queue on the staircase to go on any of the water slides. They'd been turned into pillars of salt, chlorine salt, so that the pool at the bottom of the water slides would be clean for me when the slide had completed and I had fallen in the pool. And if you'd read those documents, and all of a base document, the Gospel of Mark, which he's calling himself the Son of Man. I've got to count up how many references to God there are in that Gospel, but there's no real supernatural feats. No rising from the dead, no walking on water, no water into wine, no casting out demons, there's a crucifixion, and there's no resurrection. So therefore these things were added later, and was it to make the king and queen seem better, King Herod and his queen, for putting those events in motion that led to the crucifixion, and then because it was so much of a human rights outrage, because no one could understand what he was being charged with then, and and there's no rising from the dead. He's not a Lord and Savior with a mission to lay down his life. This view of this Freemasons, that he was a martyr who gave up his life easily and without a fight, even if they understood, there's no evidence of that in the Gospel of Mark. There's no evidence in the Gospel of Mark he even understood his accusatory question. So these Freemasons must therefore be thinking of books about his miracles and his supernatural feats, and that's all. They're also the books that have all the ideology in it. Jesus and his 12 disciples, and he was teaching about the parable of the son and the prodigal son, and it's so much more dramatic and idealistic in terms of what Jesus is said to be saying and teaching. So that's where you could say he had a cause, an ideological cause, and the Freemasons like to martyr people with ideological causes. So so that's confused me, because I'm like, well, you Freemasons obviously aren't aware of like fuckloads of things people have worked out from scholarship and academic debates on the Gospels. And I'm not a believer in Jesus. I'm not even the Gospel of Mark's Jesus, I relate to some of his ideas, but I don't go around teaching them to everyone, and I'm not a believer or a convert to Jesus. a disciple of Jesus or a person who believes in Jesus' movement, because it's too much debate just to work out what that movement was about. And you know, if attrition from the political system at the time had him carrying his cross up a hill, who would say they didn't drive him suicidal and have him carry his cross up a hill just knowing he was going to get nailed to it? You'd have to be suicidal to do that. So I don't see how they're saying, you know, he gave up too easily. And I don't see how they could say that there's any credibility, more credibility to the religion of the Freemasons with the things they'll say about Jesus in their Christian religion, about him being a martyr. He doesn't have, there's no proof that he sufficiently had a cause. Sorry, it's done it again. So yeah, I think if the Freemasons want someone who's better at ripping, pulling apart and falsifying Christianity than they are in their religion, it's me. And I can do that without disrespecting who Jesus was and what he stood for, because though my first name may or may not be from Saint Luke, of the Gospel of Luke, which, yes, it's a plagiarism. So you can say I was named after a plagiarism. I don't mind. But what you can't say is I'm not an atheist. An atheist doesn't have to have never heard of Jesus. We just don't believe he was God incarnate. We don't believe he died for our sins. He died for us, but he's still alive today. What I see going on more is like I said with Diana. It's like I think if the monarchy could have gotten away with it, they would have tried to. And be like, oh, Diana's gone to heaven, and they'd be like, but don't you have all these scientists now that have more or less convinced you, Queen, that there's no heaven where the Bible said there was, and instead there's all these other planets. And Jesus would need, he'd only be able to get 15 to 30 seconds of oxygen. And did you think about that, Queen? With your imperishable truths to be found in the Bible. And so, yeah. I mean, my opinion is you can probably show more respect for the humanity of Jesus, which even liberal Christian Bishop Spock would argue that
That was the salad yesterday on the airplane. I can't believe it hasn't been digested yet.
What would he argue?
I think that's a tomato.
Oh, sorry. He said it was the humanity of Jesus that inspired all the talk about his divinity. And it was Nicholas Schreck from the Church of Satan who said that anyone who has a unique, eccentric, or interesting way of attracting attention has always been branded by surrounding third parties to be harboring various diabolical powers. So, yeah. 20 minutes, fuck. Well, that's me. I'm Ben Franklin. Jesus. Oh, the Marquis de Sade. The Marquis de Sade, yeah, he's known for starting a sexual liberation movement called the Libertines in the 1700s in Paris. And if you've heard of terms like S&M, sadomasochism, which to these days, I think it talks about bondage and various,
No, I already did.
you know, sadomasochism. The sado in the sadomasochism is reducible to the surname Sade, as in the Marquis de Sade. And but if you want to know what I consider to be the best short piece of literature by the Marquis de Sade, it's about a 5-6 page dialogue called Dialogue Between a Priest and a Dying Man. And it's in essence, it is just a conversation, but it mixes fiction with philosophy, as I'm tending to do in my own book that I've been working on over the past number of years, with various degrees of bursting effort, and also because I'm reevaluating whether I should be adding more concepts or ditching some of the concepts that have already been explored in certain chapters. But anyway, in this conversation, there's a man who's dying, and a priest visits him to try to convert him and persuade him to become a Christian in his last moments of life. And so the priest is trying to do that, and the dying man is just sitting down and humoring him with argument. Every argument made and put forth by the priest, the dying man just shows he knows a lot more about philosophy than the priest. So the priest absolutely fails to convert the dying man. And in fact, the dying man convinces the priest to be his guest at a what's alluded to possibly being an orgy involving 6 women awaiting in a chamber. But he only extends that invite to him after he well and truly demolishes all the philosophical premises of all the arguments from this priest. And I think it's my personal opinion that the director of the movie Quills, with Jeffrey Rush, Kate Winslet and Joaquin Phoenix. Kate Winslet from Titanic, and Joaquin Phoenix from Gladiator, and Jeffrey Rush from Shine as the Marquis de Sade. Oh, and Michael Caine, he plays the, I guess you could call him a psychiatrist of his own period in time. But it is set in an asylum where the Marquis himself was detained, the Charenton asylum. And the Marquis de Sade was like the brainiest inmate or warden at this asylum. And there are some historical truths that are repeated in this film. But my personal theory is that the ongoing relationship between the Abbé, played by Joaquin Phoenix from Gladiator, he very much reminded me of the priest in this dialogue. So you can just Google dialogue between a priest and a dying man if you like in your own time, and read this dialogue for yourself, because there are books that could be 200 pages on atheism, and this dialogue impressively almost summarizes and gets the gist of all the concepts that are explored in this short dialogue. So that was one of the first and most impressive things I found about the dialogue when I first read it. But yeah, just if you watch the roleplay dynamics between Jeffrey Rush's character, the Marquis, and Joaquin Phoenix's character, the Abbé, it's very much like the priest talking to the dying man. Right down to, well, I'm not going to spoil the end, but yeah. So I guess if you like to watch it, form your own opinion. Quills, it's a brilliant film. I find it to be a special film. I think it's up there in my books. But then in his, he started this movement, the Libertines, because essentially he was like a rock star, but literature was his instrument. The printing press had not been, it had been invented, but how well used was it being in terms of what sort of documents were reaching the public? And at that time in France, they would have these cafes where people would read. They would sit down, and instead of playing with smartphones or listening to music, they would all be holding books and reading books and passing them around the table, taking turns passing around the table, because they were really happy and overjoyed in the community, because books back then were only really accessible to the wealthy. If you wanted a book, you had to hire a scribe or someone in your family, your father, a wealthy. Essentially, the wealthy only had access to literature because, if you wanted a book, someone had to come to your house with a copy of that book and then write you a copy and handwrite every page. So then the printing press is out, and that was no longer a limitation. They could bulk produce books, and this was a cause for great joy in the community, because it no longer meant that the poor couldn't read. Poverty was all that stood in the way of a poor person knowing how to read and maybe learning to write. And so they were all fucking cheering, and this libertines movement started where what I like about the Marquis de Sade in that way is that he, despite crimes of his that I haven't read his criminal reports yet. I'd like to, because there's certain elements of real noble aspirations in the backbone of many of his books. Because ahead of his time, he could see that. And this is Wayne Nickel Barnster of Tilly's Jazz. Hey. I empathize much, sorry about that, with what sort of mistreatment goes on. If you can think about today, where you've got Cardinal Pell failing to address abuse scandals and charges of failing to confront and deal with the charges that he's been concealing, abuse cases, and this sort of thing is still going on today. But de Sade saw it in his day too, and with the rights that weren't across the board in the Marquis de Sade's day, I think it shows conscience at the very least. And he wrote enough knowing that his writings were putting him at risk, and that and indeed his writings were drawing the negative attention of Napoleon Bonaparte, who hated the Marquis de Sade with a passion. Look up quotes about Marquis de Sade by Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte would organize the pigs of the day, the police, to storm your house and do a house search in case you or your family were in possession of one or more Marquis de Sade books. And if you were, that the books would be confiscated and burnt in full public view. But it got to the point that they hold him in this asylum. But by the time he was in the asylum, he was already known to be in terms of the social clique. Perhaps not all the other wardens knew who he was, but many of the cleaning staff, many of them had already been buying his books. So they were like, oh, the Marquis is staying here. And so he still wanted to keep making books. Nothing could stop him from continuing to write. And I find him to be a very inspiring writer if you given his circumstances and what he was up against. So he went on to continue writing more books while being held in the asylum. And there are accounts, apparently historical accounts, of like somehow they couldn't explain why. Like in Quills, it talks about there's a linen lady played by Kate Winslet, and so she comes to collect his dirty linen, his dirty sheets, and he would then pass her a parchment featuring a new story. They let him write more while he was in his cell because the religious psychiatrists thought it would be a good way for him to purge his demons if he could still write. But what they didn't foresee was that anything he wrote in the asylum wouldn't just stay in the asylum, because staff working in the asylum, they're collecting his dirty sheets, dirty laundry, and then he's handing and then at the same time he hands the linen lady a rolled up parchment containing the manuscript for a new book. And then she takes it to a guy on horseback, and the guy on horseback rides off and takes it to a publishing company. And he's said to have published certain written pieces while still being an unreleased detainee at the Sheraton Asylum for the Insane. And that got so bad and controversial that the staff started to confiscate his ink and quill. So it's a special story like that because, yeah. I mean, on the back of the Long Hard Road Out of Hell, on the back cover, Marilyn Manson's biography, there's a quote saying, if the Marquis de Sade had a son in a rock band who wrote a book, then this would be the book. But his books, in terms of their content, that won't apply to this dialogue between a priest and a dying man. But there are books called, there's a novel called The Crimes, I think it's The Crimes of Love. And that's filled with a series of mini stories, and they are twisted, fucked up. Like there's certain twists on the stories. The 120 Days of Sodom is it's taking the story of Sodom and Gomorrah from the Christian Bible to its more offensive extremes, as in part obviously a mockery of religion, you know, because what would go on certainly then in churches, if it doesn't always go on now, was that due to terms about the Bible being so holy and sacred, it meant that you'd be probably punished or shunned much more easily now and outcast more easily now if you ever questioned anything that was stipulated in a biblical narrative. And you know, like in the story of the 120 Days of Sodom in the Bible, there's a part in that Bible story where some people approach the town of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they're trying to I think it's two angels, and the townspeople want to rape the angels. So then this man called Lot, he was the most well-respected man in the town, and he didn't want his town to become known as a place where people could rape angels. So as a plea bargain, he offers them his own two daughters to rape instead of the angels getting raped. And so that guy was known to be the smart and most holy man in the town at the time. And the Marquis de Sade in the 120 Days of Sodom takes that, I mean, the Marquis was better educated than Christians. So, and he was offended and hated the Christian religion.
You had oral sex somewhere?
So he takes their story, the 120 Days of Sodom, and he just takes all of the. It's perverse. Like it's a.
You said you wanted to kick Dan the Song Parody Man's ass.
A woman fucks and conceives.
His story is that some girl blew him.
With a particular animal. Until it
I don't know what headphones you're on.
bears her a child.
According to Jeff, Dan stole his girlfriend.
No, I think it was a man in the town.
Thank you. Oh, Jeff, thank you. Yeah.
Fucks like a goat or some other animal until it conceives and bears him a monster. And then a monster though it be, he embuggers it. And then it skips to the next day and what goes on then. He takes it way far. And I think that you could always say he was trying to hammer the point home about just how fucked up that part of the Bible is anyway. In the Bible, yeah. And so, as if he's saying to the Christian right, well, what's that Sodom and Gomorrah story to you anyway? Isn't it? Is it not sick? You know. It's certainly not the perfect word of a creator. So I do see a lot of his really degenerate written manuscripts and books of they're almost always a massive mockery of the Bible and the Christian religion. You know, no surprise to him about priests or wealthy men going to a nunnery convent to you know, they're wealthy men of high esteem, so they can be 50-year-old perverts and go to a nunnery and purchase a 16-year-old orphan girl raised in a nunnery. And depending on the amount of money he gives to the woman who owns the nunnery, she'll then go and tell this orphan girl that was adopted there and that the man that the Lord had chosen for her had finally turned up to collect his bride. And then that, you know, 16 to 16, 18 at the most, gets just purchased, and has to sleep with and have sex at night at the bequest of this grey-haired 50-year-old wealthy you know, psychiatrist who, you know, at bed he you know, instead of saying, honey, do you feel like it tonight, she's got her back to him in the bed and he's grabbing her saying, you know, perhaps the nails, the nuns failed to inform you about the nightly duty of a wife to her husband, and then puts his hand around her mouth so she can't really scream or whinge in such a volume that it would hear or put him off. I'm fucking her at his bequest. And that sort of thing went on tons, I think, in France during the 1700s. He's said to have been an inspiration to Nietzsche. But that's the Marquis de Sade. So I'd recommend watching this movie, Quills. You might like it. Was it The Crimes of Love? There's and there's books called Justine, Philosophy in the Bedroom and Other Writings, 120 Days of Sodom and Other Writings, Juliet, and yeah, they're fucked up books. You have to know that going in. So it's more like entertainment. But yeah, they would those books were like
What props do you deserve?
I guess, what people would say about Alice Cooper albums in his day, or Ozzy Osbourne's albums in his day, or Marilyn Manson's albums. In terms of that controversy. So it's like as soon as the printing press is there and now books can go public, it was just, he's almost the only one really to have, or the most notorious one to have just had this great output of literature that just blew the minds of its readers. And I think that's because from Desade's own point of view, he did have some empathy for how they were being treated and screwed because they didn't know better, but he was educated better. He was trying to remember the title that he had. He was upper class, and yet he had this compulsion to risk getting locked up in an asylum because it really appealed to him to want to empower emotionally and inspire this sense of liberalism in the status quo and to people that couldn't even get literature. And you see that there was like there would have been a big drop in the way that the class divide would be so much more intense from one class to another, because you think about it, if only the rich had books, then they'd be talking, they'd sound so much more professional, and they'd know more things than people who couldn't afford to get handwritten transcripts and copies of, you know, libraries and volumes of all these books. So yeah, the printing press was there, but he was kind of like the rock star of books at that time. I'm getting tired now, so I'll leave it there. Yeah. Fernando, who am I?
No more fucking shades, you look crazy. Fuck off. You fucking naughty cunt. You funny man, man.
This is episode 3 of the webisodes of Deterioration. Thank you for watching. Fernando, do it again. Do it again.
No.
Come on.
Oh, you pay me $100.
You do pole dancing. Where's the pole dancing? Do some more.
It's good, yeah, it's good.
Go again. Go.
No. You pay me
Buy Gippsland Dairy, mango, passion fruit, twist yogurt from your local capital chemist. Hello, welcome to Deterioration. Here's Rach with her middle finger. Have a nice day.